actually. It's ready for Oakville #4. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Karen MacNeil, the author of the Wine Bible and the editor of Wine Speed. And we are so happy that you are here for episode 4 of our extraordinary Oakville series. It's just been an amazing tour de force of great wine so far. And we're not even done yet. We've got today's session. I'll introduce our vintners in a second, as well as numbers 5 and 6 coming up. And you can always see the schedule for those on winespeed.com. So today we're going to continue to explore what makes Oakville just sort of ground zero for extraordinary, complex, distinctive Cabernets in the Napa Valley. And as many of you already know, this small place, tiny place really, in the heart of the Napa Valley, was already recognized as of the 1860s, 100 years before the Oakville AVA, 100 years before the Napa Valley AVA. Some of the most extraordinary vintners of the Napa Valley were already gravitating to this one small region. So let me tell you who we have here with us. Joe Harden is the winemaker for Nickel & Nickel. You see him right there. And Peter Heitz is the winemaker for Turnbull. And Jeff Gargiulo is the owner of Gargiulo. Before we get everyone involved and talking, we always like to sort of set the context, set the scene. And so I'm going to see if we can bring up a Google map of the Oakville AVA. There you see it. And if you look at your sort of center of the screen there, running north-south, you see Highway 29. I'm sure many of you have been to Napa Valley or seen maps, and Highway 29 is the main north-south road in the Napa Valley. It's not really even a highway, it's a road. So let's see where we are today. Nickel & Nickel, we're going to focus in on it. The winery itself is right on Highway 29. There you see it with the little hand. And we're going to be tasting the Cellars Cabernet Sauvignon. Nickel & Nickel makes an astounding 18 different single vineyard Cabernet Sauvignons. And this one is going to be from the Cellars just north there of Opus 1, as you see. And then we'll move over to Turnbull. Many people could throw a baseball right into Turnbull's vineyard from Nickel & Nickel. I don't know if I could, but anyway, Turnbull, again, one of the top estates right there on Highway 29. But Turnbull owns a couple of very prestigious vineyards. And one of them is the Fortuna Vineyard on the eastern side of Oakville. So you see that, again, the hand there, there's the Fortuna Vineyard just north of Plumpjack and right up against the Silverado Trail and those beautiful landslide hills of the Vaca Mountain Range. We'll talk about those incredible red soils a little bit later. And we'll just move over slightly to Gargiulo Vineyards, right on the Oakville Crossroad there, just north of Tench and Screaming Eagle, just up on a knoll, actually, above Tench and Screaming Eagle. And today we're going to taste Gargiulo's Money Road Ranch, which is a ranch on a little road named Money Road. It's a very small road, actually, sort of smack dab there, right in the middle of the Oakville AVA, which spans the entire Napa Valley. It's just 5 miles across, but it goes right across the whole, the entire valley at that point. All 3 of these estates are family owned, as are 95% of all the wineries in Oakville. So we're going to get started. We'll talk about histories in a second, but I'd first like to ask all of you a might be called a big picture question. And I know you've all probably thought about this. I was just tasting all three of these wines and concentrating on them a few minutes ago. And they are all very structured wines. They're super structured. And structure comes, I think it's agreed upon worldwide, in part from tannin. But all three of these wines also have a sense of polish, a real beautiful sense of polish. So my question to all three of you is that something that you just associate in general with Oakville? Or, you're all talented, top wineries. Is that something that comes from really sophisticated winemaking and sophisticated handling of the grapes themselves? Jeff, what would you say?
Well, I would say that there is definitely a thread of silky tannins that go through all of the wines in Oakville. And I think that's one of the characteristics. So you call it polish, and I call it maybe silky tannins. And I think it definitely comes from the land and the terroir, because we are this place that gets cool enough that we cool off in the evenings and in the mornings, and then we get this nice warming. So we're not as cold as other parts of Napa Valley. And I think that contributes along, because we have several different soil types, but I think that climate is really ideal for Cabernet.
Okay, and Joe, your thought on that specific question of structure?
Yeah, I think Oakville is very unique. That would be the one word that I would describe as Oakville. And I think even from the west side to the east side, you have different types of tannin that you get in the wine, but I think they all have this fine grain elegance to them. And I think it's definitely site specific. Nickel being single vineyards, we get to make wine all the way in Calistoga down to Carneros. And I think a big contributing factor to what makes Oakville special is the quality of tannin.
The feel of the tannin. Tannin, should it have quality? I don't know, but the way it feels.
Right, and how you can, how it's polished, and I think these wines are going to age really well because of that backbone of structure and tannin.
And Peter?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with my two compatriots here. I guess I'm oftentimes asked about different parts of the Napa Valley. Different sub-appellations have important different nuances, and if you had to put them in succinct little words, I'd say that Hell Mountain is blackberries, and Spring Mountain might be green tea, and different sub-appellations. Rutherford has their dusty appeal, and I think that Oakville's appeal is a texturial note. It's about structure and texture, and why that is so present in Oakville above all the other sub-appellations, which I believe it is. I think Jeff hit on that nicely with the climatic aspect of Oakville. We have particularly warmer daytime temperatures, but we have a nice cooling breeze, persistent morning fog. There's a number of different features. And so there's obviously the west side of the valley, which we're gonna taste with the nickel wine to some degree. Has more of a morning sun appeal, and then the east side of the valley gets the afternoon sun, and those. But amongst tasting these three wines across the breadth of Oakville, I think it's amazing. There's really a similarity in texturial pleasure and creaminess. I
don't know if there's a word texturial, but I think that ought to be added to the wine lexicon. Texturial is a pretty interesting word. But I want to just say for anyone who's wondering, like, what fine grain tannins, what does that mean? One way that's been described, and one way to perhaps think about it, is in terms of sandpaper. How a higher number of sandpaper means it's finer and finer and finer, and a lower number means it's rougher and rougher. Well, Oakville's tannin would be a higher number. So I'm told by the guys at the hardware store in St. Helena. It's what you want, a higher number of sandpaper. I want to remind everyone, by the way, that we will be taking questions and are taking questions. So if you have questions about the wines of Nickel and Nickel, or the wines of Gargiulo, or the wines of Turnbull, you are welcome to ask them. Let's go into some history here for a second, because not everyone, I mean, I think everyone knows your names, but they don't necessarily know your stories. And Joe, I want to start with you, because Nickel and Nickel is the sort of sister winery of Farniente, which was established by the Farniente family and partners, I think in the late 90s. It's that if you have been to the Napa Valley, you drive up the valley and you see this beautiful white Victorian farmhouse on the right-hand side as you're driving north. And it has all the beautiful wildflowers and the horses. And every now and then there's a white horse. And I cannot tell you how many people say to me, "Is that Cheval Blanc?" I'm like, "No, Cheval Blanc is in Bordeaux." But it is Nickel and Nickel, and they're famous too. So give us a few sentences about, give us a quick capsulization of how Nickel and Nickel came to be.
Yeah, so Beth and Gil Nickel ventured over to Napa Valley in the late 1970s, and they kind of stumbled upon Farniente, which is a winery just south of us, and the winery over there had been closed since Prohibition, and it took them from 1979 to 1982 to restore that beautiful winery. And then fast forward a couple of years, in the mid 1990s, the John Solinger Vineyard became available for sale from Alex Liborni, who's a very famous wine grower in Napa Valley, and they jumped at the opportunity. So it's a 40-acre parcel of land with an old Victorian named after John Solinger, who he settled in this farmstead in the late 1880s. And Beth and Gil Nickel were really pioneers and go-getters. They decided, instead of like growing Farniente and making more wine out of there, let's start something totally different. Let's be creative. And they came up with this single vineyard, single variety approach, which was really the first of its kind in the early 2000s. The first vintage was 2002. And I know that when talking to Beth Nickel, people didn't think it was going to be successful, that they couldn't wrap their heads around the single vineyard approach. And fast forward to now, we're making 18 single vineyard cabs from all the way to Calistoga down as far south as Carneros, which we have with Chardonnay. So they were really pioneers on the single vineyard approach. And I've been here for a handful of years now, and it's been an incredible opportunity to be able to take the precision and the quality that it takes to make these single vineyard wines.
Some people might say they were actually crazy, but they were larger than life. They are, I mean, Beth is still larger than life. Unfortunately, Gil passed away.
Yeah.
But this really is a Burgundian kind of approach to Cabernet with all these single vineyards. And actually, that is something that Turnbull does too. It doesn't have 18 Cabernets, but Peter, tell us a little bit about Turnbull, because I know you're very focused on specific vineyards as well. And Turnbull was, of course, started in part by the famous California architect, William Turnbull.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, Turnbull was founded in 1979 by the famous architect William Turnbull, who designed Sea Ranch out of the coast, Cake Bread next door, and he had a partner, Reverdy Johnson, who's still alive, and I think in the wine industry over in Sassoon. And they were looking to maybe bring on more financial help at some point, and eventually ended up selling the winery to the Odell family, who's owned it since then. So family-owned place, second ownership since incept in 1979. I'm the third winemaker since 1979. So a long history. People, my team, the cellar team, vineyard team, have been here for decades. And people stay places that are like family.
That's a good point.
It's extremely well run and cared for property, and the Odell family has collected several other vineyard sites in their ownership. So all the wines before the Odell family owned Turnbull were just from what we call the home ranch right next to Nickel and Nickel Solinger Vineyard, and then they've We also have the Fortuna Vineyard, which we'll be tasting today. There's
Right.
the Leopoldina Vineyard, which is up on top of what we call the Oakville Bench, up by Delaval and Peter Michael's Paradis. And then we have the Menos Vineyard up in Calistoga, which is in the farthest reaches of the Napa Valley, up near Storybook Mountain, in the northwestern corner. And so we do make single vineyard wines from those vineyards, and they are very different. And
You know, this whole idea of a Burgundian approach to Cabernet is something that I think is really worthy of people who drink Oakville Cabernet thinking about, because the entire appellation is very much focused on small vineyard plots. And I want to go to Jeff, because he too, while you're a very small family-owned winery, you are very specific about your OVX, your Oakville Crossroad plot, and your Money Road Ranch there at the end of the lane called Money Road. Tell us about your history, because whenever I think about you, I think, gosh, if there was ever a man inclined to grow things, or you know, who had growing things in his background, you were former CEO of Sunkist, the former CEO of a very large company that produced many of the tomatoes in America and much of the produce in America. So growing things is really in your background, but why start Gargiulo?
Well, I mean, basically all that CEO stuff, I was a farmer. So we grew tomatoes and we grew strawberries around the country in different places, and originally from Florida, but I loved wine. So we collected wine and always, you know, paid attention to the Karen MacNeils of the world so I could learn about wine. And eventually the farming and the wine had to come together. We had some esteemed relatives in Napa Valley, Barney and Rhodes, and we would visit them on a regular basis. And so eventually the farmer and the wine had to come together, and we decided to buy a piece of land that right after Phylloxera. So we bought the Money Road Ranch, which is 40 acres, kind of in the center of the valley, but there was a lot of parcels for sale back then. BB had parcels that were, so we explored it, typical farmer thing, dug a lot of holes, did a lot of soil analysis, and we bought the Money Road Ranch, only intending to be a grower and sell guys like John and Peter grapes. And then you know.
And they would have bought them.
Yeah, and then we did, I mean, as a farmer, we did everything we could possibly do to make that the best possible ranch. And then Jean Phillips was our land broker, who was started Screaming Eagle. And one day she called up and said, Gargiulo, I have this other property you really ought to look at. And of course, she's Screaming Eagle. And so we were in Florida, and I said, give me about, you know, a day or two and I'll try to get back out. She said, no, you don't understand. I'm going to sell it today and you're first on the list. So basically she handpicked us to buy what we call the OVX property. We bought it sight unseen, literally that day. And OVX looks at Screaming Eagle. And so we've got this fantastic, beautiful, blessed property on the east side of Oakville with this red dirt. And we make cab from both sides, from both the red dirt and OVX and the, you know, more like the, I wouldn't say typical valley floor, but more of the classic terroir on the Money Road Ranch.
Yeah. You know, we have a lot of questions coming in right now, and we're going to get to them in just 1 second here. One of the questions has been what vintages we're tasting. So if you're tasting along, or if you want to buy wine later, just so you know, we're tasting the 17 Nickel and Nickel Sullinger, the 17 Gargiulo Money Road Ranch, and the 16 Turnbull from the Fortuna Vineyard. I want to ask a question before we start tasting. A rather academic question, but from my dear friend Ron Washam, who all of you undoubtedly know. Who is a wine educator, a phenomenal writer. And he asks, in what way is soil influential on tannin? isn't tannin more influenced by winemaking and by climate? Anyone want to take that one?
The soils have a big impact in the way that the fruit ripens. I'm not a viticulturalist by training or a geologist, but I certainly, after making wine for 2 decades, I can certainly walk into a vineyard, look at the soil, and have a good understanding of what the potential tannin load and quality will be. So tannin sounds like kind of a bad word, but there's a quantity and there's a quality of tannin. They're two different things. For instance, just to simplify, the white soils that you can find in some vineyards, let's say, in Turnbull's Amenos Vineyard in Calistoga, or in patches in Howe Mountain, or famously the Quintessa Vineyard, is almost all of a volcanic white tuff. It's an ash soil. And I find those soils to make tannins that are harder to resolve as a winemaker. They tend to be a little bit more rustic and more prevalent. They have a strength to them that can be a benefit, and they have a strength to them that can be a detriment. Some of the red soils that Jeff has over at OVX, and then we have at Fortuna and at the Leopoldina Vineyard, that are a red volcanic soil that's degraded, has a high iron content. The soil is literally rusting, that's why it's red. Tends to somehow maintain acidity in the fruit, and it allows us to have balance when we pick at a higher ripeness level. So the tannins have softened and rounded, but we still have natural acidity. So that soil allows us to get to a riper place that still feels balanced, and we have rounder, creamier tannins. So as a winemaker, I like those soils a lot. They're very forgiving as a winemaker. And then the Bayonne clay, the typical valley floor soils, tend to be an even keel. They don't play as heavy a hand in tannin creation or in tannin type, but give you a nice substrate of fruit ripeness. Then farming becomes very important to try to get to the right place in ripeness.
Yes, and I have a few additional ideas, but I'm going to take them up with my friend Ron Washam when we have a glass of Oakville Cabernet. Ron, if you're listening, I'll give you a personal lesson in this later. All right, just teasing him. Let's taste the wines though, because I mean, I'm not one for delayed gratification very much, and we've been making everybody delay maybe. So let's start with the nickel and nickel Cellars, and let's see. Everyone can taste, of course. We don't want to, and everyone we hope will, all three of you will comment on each other's wines.
Yes.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for reminding me, Jeff. Here's the Cellars.
There we go.
With that great, everyone recognizes the nickel and nickel labels because
They have cool labels. I mean, these labels have been around,
yeah,
since
they're
day
very
one.
Art Deco-y,
And,
aren't
I mean, yeah, they are. They remind me in some ways of they're very classic, and some of the French labels have had that real classic look forever, and
yeah.
they nailed it way back.
Yeah, you feel like you're in a Parisian bistro when you see that Art Deco design. Tell us about this wine though, Joe.
Yeah, so this is our home estate vineyard located right behind the winery, and as Peter was mentioning, this is kind of the more Bay Loam series. So for us, we do a lot of work in the vineyards to get the wines to settle out the grapes. We have
but tell us about the flavor. But tell us about the flavor.
Okay.
Tell us about when you're a winemaker and you're standing there and you're tasting this wine.
Yep.
And you say to yourself either yes or oh no, I'm worried. I mean, like what's the flavor of yes?
For the Cellars vineyard, for me, it's always kind of a red fruited. We get more plum, a little like kind of black cherry. And I'm really looking for Cellars to have some vibrancy, some freshness on the palate. I think it's definitely more classic kind of Napa Valley cab. And then for me, we're looking for that plush, silky tannin in the Solinger vineyard. We have to keep an eye on it in the vineyard because it can get a little grippy. And so when we bring it in the cellar, we're looking to kind of create a plushness and a velvetyness. And I think this wine, like a lot of Oakville wines, has a really nice balance of freshness and elegance, but also kind of core structure and tannin. I think it's a wine that I've been fortunate to taste going back since 2002, and it's a wine that ages really well because it has that backbone of acidity and tannin in the background.
So that would be 18 years old, and my bet is that all three of these wines are going to last way beyond 18 years. But let me ask you before we move on to, what's the case production? Because we have a couple of questions about that, of this wine.
So it's a 30-acre vineyard, and I should know this off the top of my head because we're bottling it as we speak. But we usually get 3 tons per acre. So it's one of our bigger case production. It's 5,000 to 6,000 cases, and yeah, it's one of our larger estate vineyards that we get to make wine from.
Okay, very good. And I don't know. I'm glad we tasted it first because I love the freshness in this wine, and I want to talk as we go to the Turnbull and as we go to Jeff's Gargiulo. I want to talk about that concept of freshness because I feel like there's real freshness in this wine. Doesn't everybody? I mean, there's a real aliveness.
Yeah, I agree. It's just got that like immediate vibrancy when you take it in your palate, and I think it's one of these that will be, you can consume it right now and enjoy it, and probably 10 years from now you'll get something different, but it'll be perfect.
Yeah. All right, Peter, we're going to the Turnbull 2016 from the Fortuna Vineyard. This beautiful, as you were describing, kind of a slipped down landslide on the, it's just, if you haven't been to the Napa Valley, everyone, and driven up Silverado Trail right when you hit Oakville and seen these progressive landslides of red rocky material, it's quite astounding to see.
Well, I trespass on the Fortuna Vineyard almost every other day when I do my morning walk across from Gargiulo to, so if I could get a letter from Peter giving me permission to do that, that would be great.
Endless permission, Jeff. You walk away. I've actually walked all over your Money Road Ranch vineyard, and
there we go.
No, I since you're since the OVX vineyard is so close to your facility, it's a little bit tricky to trespass there without getting caught. But for sharing, I'll just stop by.
Perfect. always open for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the 2016 Fortuna Vineyard Cabernet, the vineyard's actually interesting. It has it's a 50-acre parcel, and it's a vineyard that's been planted in vines since Prohibition. So it's our longest planted vineyard, probably equal to the home vineyard right at the historic winery. But there's 2 different soil types. There's the red volcanic alluvial fan that's sloughed off the hillside, as you were nicely trying to educate people on, Karen. And that transitions, that slope, it's a very gentle slope, that transitions into the bale loam or fluvial soil, the valley floor soil. That's a combination of all the edges of all the alluvial fans going up. And then in that lower soil, there's some of the rhyolitic soils that you'll find over at the awesome Groth vineyard. So there's a whole bunch of different stuff going on with the soil. It's our most diverse vineyard in terms of soil types. And then we have a couple different row orientations, and there's a lot going on there. With the 2016
So Peter, I have to interrupt you here for a second, because you in particular, I want to ask this question too. Oh. When you ask a winemaker, you're a winemaker, a famous winemaker, about a wine, they will tell you about the soil. And that would lead almost anybody to believe that, oh, X type of soil equals Y type of flavor. But in fact, that's probably not exactly true. I mean, it's not so true that around the world you could say that flint soils equal for sure these flavors, volcanic soils equal for sure these flavors, right?
Yeah. That's true.
Not exactly, but you probably have my question is, you have a sense of that. it seems like you have a sense of that. You feel like, I see these red rocky soils. I see these fluvial soils.
Yeah, the soil's like the base material. You can't, you shouldn't or can't change your soil. You shouldn't or can't change your climate or your microclimate. And so those things are set. When you have a vineyard, we're all talking about estate properties, properties that we love very much. Most of Oakville, as you pointed out, is family owned. They're small parcels. People are really focused on what that place tastes like. The two things you can't change are soil and climate. You can change row orientation, the clonal material of the variety that you plant, the trellis type, how you farm it. You can change all those things, but you can't and shouldn't change the soil and the weather. So they're foundational aspects of winemaking. And it would a little bit like your genetic makeup. You can't, or your heritage. You can't change those things. And if you have a kid and they're growing up, those things are baked in. You can change their educational system. You can do different things to help, but the basic nature is set. And so in winemaking, as a winemaker, everybody in Oakville is working with, of course, incredible soils. Our jobs are to highlight and show off those sites and the vintage the wines come from, and have restraint to stay out of the way and let that happen.
But let me ask you, I'm going to press you on this. If someone said the Eastern Oakville red soils, would your mind immediately say that's going to translate to ABC flavors? Or
I don't think flavors, I don't think it's a flavor aspect. I mean, if I planted Chenin Blanc on red soils, I'd get a different flavor, obviously, than Cabernet. But within Cabernet, amongst the clones, let's say, the clonal variety is a big deal. It's the same difference as like
I know. The kaleidoscope is so big, so many factors.
It's so big. But in general, like the reason that Jeff bought OVX property with San Unseen, when Jean said, buy it today, all she had to say was red soils. Right, Jeff? And
that's right. Yeah. And I would say that the red soils do have an element of cocoa, creme brulee, coffee in the Cabernet that I don't see in some of the other soils. But I'm not saying they're all like that, but I think there is an element of that that's consistent.
I'm very, very fortunate to get to farm and make wine from those soils. I think they're really special, and they don't exist everywhere. When they exist with the right climate and you have enough resources to farm that properly and enough restraint to stay back from that, you can really make special wines from.
Yeah. No, well said. I'm just thinking, because when all of us who are not like you, winemakers or vintners, when we taste a wine, the truth is that we don't know exactly why it's so good. We know that it's good. We can feel that, we can taste that, we can sense that, but we don't always know why. And it's interesting to hear. We hear what you did, and we hear about the soil, we hear about the climate. And I guess the truth is, even as a journalist, that I've come to realize that the kaleidoscope of possibilities is just so big, and it's always turning. And who knows what was a dominant idea at any given moment. But thank God for that kaleidoscope, right? Because it resulted in whatever magical way and mysterious way, I hope remains a mystery.
I love that it should remain a mystery, Karen. I think that is the most important thing. If we knew how it worked, it would stop being magic.
Then it would become, it would become cola or something. Jeff, let's move to the Gargiulo, and we are all tasting all three of these wines again, and we hope you are tasting along with us, or will taste some of these wines after hearing these wonderful comments by Jeff, Joe, and Peter. So Jeff, tell us about this wine. What you think about it.
Well, one of the things that I think Peter and Joe have alluded to is that Oakville is a lot of family estates, and we're all, whether we're the proprietors or whether we're whoever we are the winemakers, we have a lot of passion about this place. And I think that we all have a lot of respect for it. Our winemaker, Christoph Anderson, does a fabulous job. and he's been with us since 2002. And
Yeah,
so
he's a
our
good
wines
guy.
have a great deal of credit to his hand. And I want to give Christoph that. But I mean, you know, one of the things about our wines, we make, and we talked about terroir, we make like 30 or 40 different fermentations on any given year. And you can taste one side of a vineyard versus the other side of a vineyard, and they all have some differences. So it's pretty interesting like that. The Money Road, which is in your glass, was the first vineyard that we started with, and we bought that one and replanted it. And since it was a valley floor vineyard, me being a farmer, we actually spent 2 years putting drainage in that vineyard to try to make it as, you know, whatever, as deeply drained as possible. But it tends to give off what I would call black fruits, and the soil is black, but it gets, you know, like lots of blackberry. Sometimes I call it dark burned cherries, like if you put cherries in a pan and burn them a little bit, that's kind of, you know, it's different than the OVX, and they're a mile apart. I mean, you know, as I walk every day from one to the other, the birds fly, you know, it's less than a mile. I have to walk 2 miles to get there, but, and they're that different. I mean, it really is amazing how it is. And I love that, because it gives us the opportunity to have 2 different Cabernets, completely different. But what I think all of us in the estate wine world are able to achieve is a consistency of quality and a consistency of flavors, but it's a mystery. As Peter said, every year, the wines will always deliver something a little bit different. And that makes it really fun as a collector. Collectors can buy the same wines every year, and yet they have vintage differences, and they can say, well, I remember 2017, what was that like versus 16, and all of that. And by the way, this is 2017.
Right. What is the case production on this, Jeff?
It's about 1,500 cases.
1,500 cases. And Peter, we forgot to ask you about the Turnbull. What was the Turnbull Fortuna?
When you asked Joe, I started trying to do the math. The pack label says we made 34 barrels, so that would be something like about 850 barrels, or 850 cases.
See, this is why the world needs journalists, because you guys don't always know these things. I probably should have looked this. I probably did that math ahead of time. Listen, we've got a really great question that I want to ask all 3 of you, which is, this is a very astute question. Does one have to know all about soil or climate to be able to judge a wine, or even better yet, pick out a good Cabernet?
Well, my theory is you can tell the story all day long. Sooner or later, they got to drink it.
Yeah. And then it's just the visceral response to the wine?
Correct. I think, and we could go into a long story about how people taste, but most of us taste about the same. And so the people are going to like it or not like it because it's good or it's not good. I mean, I really believe that.
So you don't necessarily need to know about the climate or soil of a place to have.
Well, I mean, you can down the road, but I think at the end of the day, I mean, once you take that glass and you put your nose in it and you taste it, and you're going to know whether it's something you get pleasure out of or not. And if you drink enough wine, that becomes pretty obvious.
Yep, pleasure is an important word.
I think it's a lot like music too, where I might not be able to play the piano, but I definitely know when someone's really talented at playing the piano. I think it's a feeling. It's I think you can always dive deeper and kind of get into the soils and get into the nuances of these individual wines. But I mean, for me, it's an honor just to be here with you guys, because these 3 wines, I think, all have a sense of place. They all have their given style, and I think that's what makes wine fun. I think these are all beautifully well-made wines.
That piano analogy is a great one.
I like that one. Yeah, as a musician, I like that one a lot.
I know, Jeff is a musician. And you know what? We forgot to hold up. Here's the Gargiulo, by the way. Money Road Ranch, the big GV. And here's, Peter, this bottle is like, okay, I'm going to just do a little
You didn't drink enough. If it's still heavy, you haven't enjoyed it yet.
And by the way,
Okay.
The reason we do this is because I wear glasses and I can't see very well, so I want to know where my bottle is so I can see it. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And here's the Turnbull Fortuna Vineyard. You have to look when you're buying the Turnbull, by the way, you'll see Fortuna in smaller red letters going across.
We put that really small so Jeff can't tell which one's which.
You know, I like that. It's very classy. That's cool. It's a cool thing. It's like I remember buying way back the Robert Mondavi. Can't remember this. They used to put unfined at the bottom like that, or unfiltered, sort of, and that was a different wine than the sort of say the release. And I always thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I want to ask all three of you now a little bit about the importance of, because these are significant wines, right? They're wines with real gravitas, all three of them. Wines that can be cellared a long time. And the ability of a wine to age, we know, is related to its quality. Only great wines have an ability to age. Your basic, I don't know, $15 Merlot, you should drink it right when you get it home from the grocery store. But so we've talked about tannin, we know about structure, and we know about age worthiness. But my question is going to be, what about the element of freshness in Cabernet? Is that an important aspect that you think about in your own wine? Jeff, let me start with you.
Well, one thing and Barney Rhodes was a legend in this valley. And one thing he told me before we ever started, he said, it's all about balance. And if a wine's not in balance when it's young, it's not going to be in balance when it gets old. And I really believe that. So if you drink it and there's something out, it's probably not going to change. Yeah.
And freshness is part of that. I knew Barney before he passed away. For those of you who don't know the name Barney Rhodes, he was Napa Valley's first, he was a doctor, a medical doctor, the owner of a vineyard, Bella Oaks, with his wife, Belle. And by everyone's estimation, the first great collector of Napa Valley wines, and in a certain sense, the first real expert collector on Napa Valley wines.
And he was considered a great palate worldwide.
He was a great palate.
And so people would, even new vintners, and many of us would always bring their wines to Barney to taste when they started. And you're right. I think the freshness is absolutely a key to the beginning of balance.
Okay, Joe, what do you think about freshness?
I think it's really important.
In Cabernet.
In Cabernet, I think it's really important because I think for me, I want to enjoy my wines with food, and I think freshness can bring kind of softness to the palate and can pair well with food when you're enjoying it. I think bigger wines can sometimes you just want to sit down and drink them by itself, which isn't bad either. But for me, I want the experience to be with food. And I think freshness kind of helps attribute to that kind of umami flavor. It's always inviting me back for more. And I think it does come down to balance. I also don't want a Cabernet that's going to rip my teeth, enamel off. And so, to each their own. But for me, I do want some mouth-watering liveliness on the palate for Cabernet.
Yeah, umami, sometimes referred to as the sixth basic sense, discovered by Japanese researchers about 20 years ago, often translated into English as savoriness. Things like meat juices, Parmesan cheese, tomatoes, soy sauce, all of these things have lots of umami. And great Cabernet, in my opinion, has lots of umami. Peter, is freshness for you the same as acidity, or does it go beyond acidity?
It's freshness is important, as Jeff and Joe have pointed out, and the nickel and nickel bottling here out of these three wines definitely exhibits the most joie de vivre, red fruit and focus, and I guess I think of freshness as being more about lift and focus, and less about sideway and power. And I think that Joe's creation from Solinger in 17 is a beautiful, beautiful result of this vineyard and his team. That wine has clean, crisp lines. It's not about an acid lift. It's about fruit picking. As Cabernet ripens or other grapes, if you pick earlier, you have more red berries and freshness. And then I think there's kind of a little bit of a dead zone. And then there's black fruits, darker, richer tones. And from tasting these wines, I would say that Christoph with the Money Road and myself with the Fortuna picked in that darker ripening tone.
Yeah,
and
later.
Joe and his team chose to pick Hollinger in a red freshness mode. So you can sense the excitement of the beginning of the vintage. And some of my favorite wines every year in our cellar are the early pickings, where you have that fresh vibrancy, it's verve. It has more verve. I was going to come up with another imaginary word for you, Karen, but I held back.
Oh no, don't hold back.
I was going to go with verveness.
Verveness. Okay, we love it.
Yeah. And so I think that Joe captured that. And I like that it feels alive and dynamic. And I think that wine should, really great wine. And I think all three of these are great wines. It doesn't just please your mouth and your nose, but makes your heart have a little pop or your brain have a little thought. And that dynamic tension between freshness and fatness and power and focus, those things swirl up and become something. That kaleidoscope, I love that you were using kaleidoscope as this idea of all the factors that go into wine. And then the wine has that same kaleidoscope. And Joe's wine here has a kaleidoscope swirl that is sparkly on the outside. It's fresh. And I love that.
The one thing we haven't talked about is that in Peter's pouring the great 16 vintage, and the 17 vintage was obviously, well, we won't talk about what happened in 17, but to me, all the wines had that really fresh vibrancy in the wines. I can remember going through all the blending in 17.
Oh, in 17, yeah.
Because 16 is just a great iconic vintage. I mean, everybody's going to say 16 is just a fabulous, and it is. And then 17, we had the fires. And of course, all great estates got picked before the fires or the wine went away. But the vibrancy of the 17s, they weren't as big as the 16s. They weren't as deep, but they all. And I think it's in the glass here, and I think it's in every bottle that I've tasted, and I can remember it from the beginning. Joe, you probably got that too. I mean, it's
I do think that my 16 shows more depth and resonance, and that's a result of the vintage, not the winemaking or the vineyard. But I love the 17 vintage. We had, I think, these other two wines, 17's fantastic. My 17s are amazing. I actually prefer the 17 vintage over the 16s in that winemakers that taste a lot of wine, we like freshness and verve and focus.
I'm with you. I'm the same way.
Yeah.
So that leads us to in a sense the last question, and thanks, Jeff, for bringing up the fact that 17 was, of course, a difficult vintage, although in Napa Valley, because of those fires, and in Napa Valley, luckily, more than 90% of the grapes and all three of your estates, all the grapes were in. But the idea of freshness and vibrancy, one of the last questions we have here is really what constitutes a wine, and the asker of the question uses the term beautiful. What makes, this will be our final question of the day, what makes a Cabernet beautiful? 3 words.
I think eye of the beholder.
Pardon me?
I think eye of the beholder. I think.
The eye of the beholder. So beautiful is in the eye of the beholder. All right. Peter, Jeff?
Smell, taste, finish.
Smell, taste, finish. Okay. And they all have to be great. Yeah.
I think of beautiful as lift, focus, and restraint.
Lift, focus, and restraint. All right. So there we have it. Lots of good things to think about, and certainly lots of deliciousness in these glasses. Thank all of you so much for this Oakville session number 4 in our series. These wines are just so hedonistic and beautiful, and they have lift, beauty, and focus. So
let's give it up to Karen, one of the
again.
great wine educators out there, and thank you for your knowledge and your leadership. Cheers.
Thank you.
Karen.
Cheers,
Thank
Karen.
you, gentlemen.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks,
Cheers, guys.
everybody, for joining us. I'm Karen MacNeil. I'm the author of the Wine Bible, and this has been the series, The Great Wines of Oakville, episode number 4. Thank you for joining us. We really love it when you help explore what makes Oakville so distinctive. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you for episode 5 and 6 coming up. And again, good evening.